No one expected the pop star behind Karma Chameleon to end up in a prison jumpsuit. Boy George wasn't just a singer, he was an enigma, an androgynous icon in a world still clinging to tradition. His rise to fame was meteoric, his presence unforgettable, and his songs infectious. But beneath the makeup, the oversized hats, and the theatrical flair was a man quietly unraveling. Fame for George came with a heavy cost: addiction, heartbreak, public scrutiny, and eventually, handcuffs. Before he became a judge on The Voice UK, before he re-emerged as a reformed icon of self-awareness and spiritual clarity, Boy George was involved in one of the most disturbing scandals in British pop culture history. In 2007, headlines blared with a story too outrageous to believe. George had been arrested for falsely imprisoning and assaulting a male escort. The world gasped, the media descended, and the courts didn't look away. The flamboyant star of the 80s, once adored by millions, was now a convicted criminal. But that's just part of the story. What the cameras didn't catch was the decades-long buildup. A closeted relationship with his bandmate, spiraling drug use masked by fame, a culture obsessed with tearing down what it once worshipped. Boy George's life wasn't a tabloid sideshow. It was a cautionary tale, wrapped in sequins and eyeliner. In this episode of Aussie Uncovered, Legends and Secrets, we dig into the color, the chaos, and the cell doors that closed behind a global icon. Because before the glitter faded, Boy George had already revealed the truth. Just not everyone was paying attention. It was London, early 1980s, a time of rebellion, reinvention, and reinvigoration. Britain was drenched in the gray of Thatcherism, but on the streets, a colorful resistance was blooming. Punk had splintered, new wave was rising, and androgyny was not just a look, it was a statement. In the heart of this cultural revolution stood a boy from Eltham named George Allen O'Dowd, who would soon be known to the world as Boy George. He didn't just arrive, he exploded onto the scene, into people's living rooms, and into global pop consciousness. His band, Culture Club, was unlike anything else, multiracial, genre-defying, gender-bending. With George at the center, adorned in braids, dramatic makeup, and bold kimonos, the group became a spectacle of contradictions that the world couldn't turn away from. Their music blended soul, reggae, pop, and British New Romanticism, a cultural cocktail as unpredictable as its frontman. Culture Club's debut album, Kissing to Be Clever, 1982, and the single Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, introduced Boy George to the masses. His soft-spoken, enigmatic presence in interviews clashed with his striking image. He was both shy and flamboyant, mystical and grounded. He played with perception, blurring lines between masculinity and femininity at a time when such ambiguity could cause outrage. He didn't just challenge norms, he dared people to question their own discomfort. But while the public saw a trailblazing figure and pop innovator, behind the scenes was a man already battling inner demons. The fame came fast, and so did the pressure. George was not just a singer, he was a symbol. And symbols are rarely allowed to simply be human. As Culture Club reached dizzying heights, topping charts in the UK, the US, and across the globe, the band members were wrestling with silent wars. Most notably, the forbidden and unspoken relationship between George and drummer John Moss. Their romance, kept hidden from the public, was filled with passion, volatility, and betrayal. Breakups happened backstage, breakdowns occurred in hotel rooms, and the tension bled into the music. And then came the substances. At first, drugs were a whisper, present at parties, easy to dismiss. But for George, heroin became an escape, a secret confidant. The conflict of living a lie, romantically and emotionally, began to weigh him down. Publicly, he was the flamboyant star who turned awkward TV interviews into theater. Privately, he was slipping into addiction, leaning further into control and self-destruction. By the mid-1980s, cracks began to show. The albums were still selling, the videos still playing on MTV, but something had shifted. The glow around Boy George was dimming, not because of scandal yet, but because the joy was draining from his performances. The chemistry on stage was becoming forced, the interviews more guarded. And when the truth of his heroin addiction finally surfaced, through a tabloid frenzy that followed a police drug bust in his London home, it became clear. This wasn't just a celebrity unraveling. It was a personal implosion. The media pounced, Culture Club fractured, and Boy George was left to face a brutal reality. The same world that had elevated him for his audacity would now devour him for his fragility. This was the backdrop of Boy George's life: fame as a double-edged sword, identity as both weapon and target, and love that could never be named out loud. And as the 80s bled into the 90s and then into a new millennium, his past would not stay buried. Instead, it would rise again, in the form of a criminal charge that would stun even his most jaded critics. The story was far from over. It was about to get darker. Before the prison sentence, before the mugshots and the shameful headlines, there was the boy with the painted face and a dream as loud as his outfits. Born in 1961 into a working-class Irish family, George O'Dowd grew up feeling like an outsider in a home where masculinity was rigid and Catholic guilt ran deep. He didn't fit the mold, and he didn't try to. In the clubs of Soho and Camden, he found his people, creatures of the night, dressed in silk and sequins, who blurred gender and flaunted identity like war paint. Boy George became a fixture in the Blitz Kids scene, a flamboyant collective that included future icons like Steve Strange and Marilyn. These weren't just parties, they were revolutions in lipstick and eyeliner. And George? He wasn't just showing up, he was stealing the show. By 1981, his outrageous style caught the eye of music manager Malcolm McLaren, and soon after he was fronting a new band, Culture Club. Alongside bassist Mikey Craig, drummer John Moss, and guitarist Roy Hay, the group didn't look like a traditional pop band, and they didn't sound like one either. But when George's haunting vocals met reggae grooves and soulful hooks, the alchemy was undeniable. Then came Do You Really Want to Hurt Me?, a fragile, pleading anthem that catapulted them into global stardom. The video played on MTV, and America was mesmerized. Who was this person? Was he a man? A woman? Was he gay? British tabloids screamed for answers, but George dodged every label with a wink and a lipstick-stained smile. The band followed with hit after hit: Time, Clock of the Heart, I'll Tumble For Ya, Karma Chameleon. By 1984, Culture Club had sold millions, won a Grammy, and were on par with the biggest names in pop. But fame was just the spotlight. Behind the curtains, chaos brewed. George was in love with John Moss, the band's drummer. Relationship was toxic, filled with jealousy, secrecy, and emotional warfare. Moss, who refused to go public with the romance, would allegedly manipulate George, driving him deeper into insecurity and emotional dependency. Their love inspired songs, but also sabotage. The studio became a battleground. Lyrics were weaponized. On tour, tempers flared. At award shows, smiles were forced. And when the love started to rot, so did everything else. George, already teetering under the pressure of hiding his identity, turned to heroin. He described it later as a slow suicide he welcomed. His public appearances grew erratic. During interviews, he rambled. On stage, he'd forget lyrics. Rumors of drug use swirled long before the truth exploded. In 1986, Culture Club was working on their fourth album when everything fell apart. George was arrested for heroin possession. Days later, the band's keyboardist, Michael Rudetsky, was found dead of a heroin overdose in George's home. The press devoured the story. The scandal was biblical. The image of the proud, theatrical, composed Boy George collapsed overnight. Culture Club disbanded. The fall was complete. But even after the implosion, George didn't disappear. He released a solo album, Sold, and found modest success in Europe. He took up DJing, explored spirituality, and fought to get clean. The world, however, had moved on. To many, Boy George was now a punchline, another tragic tale of 80s excess and collapse. Then, in 2006, a strange story hit the news. Boy George had been ordered to do community service in New York City, sweeping streets as punishment for falsely reporting a burglary. Tabloids reveled in the humiliation. Paparazzi stalked him as he pushed brooms. But the worst was yet to come. In 2007, the pop world gasped again. George was arrested in London after a male escort claimed he had been handcuffed to a wall and beaten inside George's flat. The story was too bizarre to be fiction. George denied it, but the evidence and the victim's bruises said otherwise. The press descended, courtrooms filled. The man once adored by millions was now on trial not just for assault, but for cruelty. In 2009, Boy George was sentenced to 15 months in prison. He served 4. But the sentence wasn't just judicial, it was cultural. His name, once glittering, now came with an asterisk. This was no longer about drug addiction, or a toxic relationship, or fame gone sour. This was about a man who had spiraled too far, whose pain had begun to inflict pain on others. The world had seen him rise in fabulous color. Now it was watching him fall, in monochrome, behind bars. And yet, even in the wreckage, Boy George would not vanish, because legends don't disappear, they transform. The headlines were damning. Boy George jailed for handcuffing escort. The icon of tolerance and eccentricity had become a cautionary tale of violence and control. It began with a casual encounter in 2007. George had invited a Norwegian escort, Audun Carlsen, to his flat in East London. What started as a photo session quickly spiraled into something far darker. Carlsen would later testify that George became paranoid, accusing him of tampering with his laptop. Then, in a harrowing turn, George handcuffed him to a wall fixture and allegedly beat him with a metal chain. Carlsen escaped barefoot into the London night, bruised and terrified. The media devoured every detail, painting the incident as a twisted culmination of George's demons: unresolved trauma, obsessive behavior, and drug-fueled paranoia. George was arrested, charged with assault and false imprisonment, and in 2009, after a brief but explosive trial, he was sentenced to 15 months in jail. For the world, this was more than scandal. It was a betrayal. How could the man who once sang about love and healing now be at the center of such brutality? The emotional descent wasn't sudden. It had been brewing for decades. George had long confessed that his struggle with control and obsession came from years of repression, unhealed heartbreak, and addiction. In interviews years later, he admitted, "I was a broken person, and I broke things around me. I didn't understand healthy boundaries, especially in love." But even his confessions didn't erase the damage. In prison, George was placed in HM Prison Pentonville, one of London's oldest and harshest facilities. Gone were the stage lights, the makeup, the attention. He was stripped down, anonymous, and alone. For a man whose entire identity had been built on expression and flamboyance, this was a reckoning in brutal grayscale. He was released after 4 months for good behavior. But the sentence had already been served in the public mind. The comeback trail would be steep and slippery. What made the scandal so shattering was not just the act, it was who did it. Boy George had been a symbol of defiance and acceptance, a trailblazer who gave voice to the queer community at a time when silence was expected. His descent into violence wasn't just personal, it felt communal, as though something pure had been stained. Yet, as with every complicated figure, there was another side. After prison, George began to speak openly about the incident, not as a deflection, but as a confessional. He acknowledged his past patterns, obsession, anger, and control, and admitted that they were rooted in unprocessed grief from his years with John Moss and the trauma of hiding his true self. "I was always performing," he said, "even when I wasn't on stage." The media's response had been ruthless. Tabloids branded him Monster George and Chained Madness. Fans were split. Some abandoned him entirely. Others clung to hope that the man they once adored was still in there somewhere. He returned to the stage, gradually, starting with small shows, then DJ gigs, and eventually tours. But the public no longer saw Boy George in Technicolor. He was now viewed through a lens of contradiction, both victim and perpetrator, both wounded and wounding. Perhaps the most haunting image came not from the courtroom or the prison, but from George himself. In one interview, reflecting on his lowest point, he said quietly, open quote, "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but I didn't know how to love without hurting," close quote. It was the kind of line that clung to you, like one of his lyrics. This wasn't just a pop star caught in scandal. This was a man who had built his identity on visibility and difference. And when that identity cracked, the fall was violent and public. His story blurred every boundary between art and madness, love and possession, expression and destruction. And perhaps that is why it stayed with people. Not because he shocked the world, but because he reflected the chaos many hide behind makeup, fame, and a smile. In the end, Boy George was no longer just the voice behind Karma Chameleon. He became the embodiment of its meaning, constantly shifting, always changing, never quite at peace. At Aussie Uncovered, Legends and Secrets, we approach stories like Boy George's with both caution and empathy, because to speak of him is to speak of conflict between persona and person, icon and inmate, legend and liability. Boy George is a rare case where fame did not just amplify the man, it mutated him. He was born into a world unready for his existence, and instead of waiting for acceptance, he forced visibility through glitter, through makeup, through haunting lyrics and daring interviews. That bravery changed pop culture. He didn't just sing, he showed millions that gender, identity, and sexuality were fluid, powerful, and worth celebrating. He made queerness visible at a time when others were being erased. That deserves respect, and we give it fully. But Legends and Secrets does not romanticize pain when it turns outward. Boy George's violent behavior in 2007 was not just a mistake. It was a manifestation of years of unchecked trauma, control issues, and emotional damage. He went beyond self-destruction. He crossed a line into hurting others. No artistry can justify assault. No trauma can excuse cruelty. And yet, no scandal should erase the context either. Because what his story reveals is more complicated than villain or victim. Boy George was not a monster born in fame. He was a fragile child who never felt safe, who discovered power through performance, but never learned boundaries in love. His relationship with John Moss, hidden, intense, toxic, was perhaps the blueprint for everything that followed. When intimacy was shameful, it became addictive. When control was the only form of love he understood, it became dangerous. And yet, he tried to come back. After prison, George didn't hide. He didn't excuse. He stepped into the public eye again and said, open quote, "I've made mistakes that cost me, and they should have." Close quote. That honesty matters. It matters in a world where celebrities dodge accountability or blame the system. George didn't ask for forgiveness. He earned it by facing himself, by rebuilding his career slowly, and by mentoring new artists on shows like The Voice UK. Does that mean we forget? No. But it means we remember both. The boy who painted his face to survive, and the man who abused his power. Both are Boy George, and both are part of a larger truth, that legends are not born flawless. They are born from fire, and some get burned along the way. To our audience, we ask, what do you see when you look at Boy George? A trailblazer of style and sound, a prisoner of his own pain, a cautionary tale of when fame meets fragility, or maybe all of the above. This channel believes in telling stories with the shadows intact, because in those shadows are the lessons we refuse to learn until it's too late. Boy George is not just a character from the past. He is a mirror of the cost of brilliance, the cracks in charisma, and the truth that even icons can break. Long before the jail sentence, before the public disgrace, before the world turned cold, there was a boy on stage wearing makeup like armor, singing with a voice that felt both wounded and wise. That boy made the world pause, not because he was perfect, but because he was honest in a way pop stars rarely are. And maybe that's what hurts most. Boy George didn't just fall. He fell in front of us, on TV screens, on magazine covers, in songs that once brought comfort, but now echo with complexity. Every time Do You Really Want to Hurt Me plays, it asks a different question now. It asks if we ever really understood him, if he ever really understood himself. His story isn't clean. It isn't tied with a redemption bow. It lingers like eyeliner after a long night, smudged but unforgettable. After prison, George returned, older, quieter, but still radiant in his own defiant way. He judged talent shows, released new music, and even reunited with Culture Club. But something was always different. The boy who once demanded to be seen now seemed cautious of the spotlight. The glitter was still there, but the magic, it had scars. And maybe that's the point. Legends like Boy George don't end where the fame ends. They stay in our culture like unfinished sentences, reminders of how much can be gained and lost in the pursuit of identity. He showed us that color can hide pain. That performance can become a prison, that sometimes the brightest stars burn from the inside first. In the end, we remember him not just for the chart toppers or the scandals, but for being brave enough to unravel in public. Few dare, fewer survive it. Some stories are never told, but now, you know.